Hi there, Guy from Midwinter Minis here. In this video I'm going to show you how to paint the sandstone and glowing blue theme for Necrons, or any other miniature you want, in easy to follow steps. First off, let's talk about the super boring first step. For this paint scheme, and really any other scheme that requires a lot of dry brushing, assembly is where you can make things really easy for yourself further down the line. By taking a few more seconds to remove the major mould lines on the models you're making, you stop them from catching the paint when you dry brush, which inadvertently highlights a part of the model that you really don't want to be showing off. Use the back of your hobby knife or clippers to gently scrape away at the mould line, or any rough areas that remain from clipping the piece from the sprue, until they're nice and smooth. This is also the time to add any large, solid pieces or bits of debris you'll want on your base. Superglue sets them quickly and holds well enough, but if you've got time to spare, use PVA, as the bond is generally a little bit stronger over time. Once you've removed your mould lines and assembled your models, you'll want to prime them for painting. I primed these Necrons using Halford's grey plastic primer. If you're not familiar, Halford's is a car and bicycle accessory and repair chain in the UK. Now this primer was the princely sum of £6.49 and has great coverage. It leaves a nice tacky feel to the model with a nice matte finish. If you're doing a big batch of spraying, wear a protective mask. You don't want to be breathing a lot of this stuff in. An essential step not to miss in this process is to do a Bane impression.
You merely adopted the dark. I was born in it.
Give the can a good old shake for about a minute or so, and spray in short bursts from about 30 cm or 12 inches away, rotating the model as you go. Make sure to catch from the top down and the bottom up, and get all those awkward angles. You can use whatever plastic primer you like, just test it out first on something till you get a feel for it, especially if it's your first time. Make sure it leaves a nice workable finish, not too glossy and not too thick. Let this dry a couple of hours to make sure that it's fully cured. Before we start base coating, we need to add our cracked stone texture. I'm using Citadel's Agrellan Earth, but there are other Crackle mediums available. It doesn't need to have a colour or pigment, as we'll be painting all over this anyway. So just slop a bit of paint on the larger armour plates and flatter areas, and also to the base of the model. Avoid any sources of the blue light like the energy coils on the weapons. Paint it relatively thick. The thicker the paint, the more pronounced the flakes and cracks will be. Too thin and it won't really be that noticeable. At room temperature, this stuff cures fully in about 30 minutes. If the room is too cold, it will take hours and hours to cure. If you try using a hairdryer to speed up the process, the cracks will be smaller and more likely to flake off, so don't bother, just give it some time. While we're waiting for the Crackle paint to dry, we can add some dirt texture. I'm using Citadel Armageddon dust, but you can use anything you like to add texture. PVA and fine sand, superglue and garden dirt, as well as random spots on the model. Don't forget to add it to the base too. Now whatever you do, don't use baking soda and superglue. I've seen a few people do this in other videos, and don't get me wrong, it looks great, but it isn't a good idea for the long term. Sodium bicarbonate can react with your paints over time and create weird globby crystals which ruin your paint job. Give the texture paint and dirt a few hours to dry. It looks really bad and patchy right now, but it'll look awesome soon. Hopefully. Next up, we're going to base coat a nice khaki desert colour. I'm using Citadel Zandri dust spray. Any regular khaki colour will do if you can't get hold of this. Same deal as priming, don't forget the mask, and one coat should do it at this point. If you miss any areas or hard to reach spots, touch it up with another spray or get in there with a paintbrush. Thin your paint on your palette with a tiny touch of water and hide any of that grey primer. Once your base coat is solid, it's time to apply an earth tone umber wash to the whole miniature. Use something like Citadel's Agrax Earthshade, Army Painter Strong Tone, or any other brown tone shade you have. Apply a decent amount with a larger brush and move the wash all around the model, making sure it settles in all the recesses. You don't have to be super accurate here, we're just creating the darker shady areas, and most of this will be covered by more layers of lighter paints. As I'm doing this demonstration as part of a 2000 point army speed paint, I'm cheating a little bit and using my DIY earth tone dip wash. I'll make a video on how to make this inexpensive, effective wash in the future. Make sure to subscribe if you don't want to miss out. Let the model completely dry, as we don't want any moisture at all on the models for the next few stages. Here's a side-by-side comparison of the Agrax Earthshade and my DIY dip wash. The dip wash is on the left, Earthshade is on the right. Personally, I prefer my own. I would say that, but it doesn't tea stain like Agrax Earthshade does, and it seems to settle in the recesses a bit more and has a richer tone. All the more reason to subscribe, and I'll show you how to make it. Dip washing is also really good for staining your hands, so don't be an idiot like me and wear gloves. Also, just a random note, I hope you're enjoying the music. I made it myself. I work in the music industry by trade, and this is a soundtrack piece I created specifically for playing 40k. I thought it would work well in this video too. So back to the painting, we're going to go back to Zandri dust and a method called drybrushing to build that khaki colour back up. Just a quick word on the brush we'll be using for the dry brush stages. It should be relatively large and flat, at least compared to the model you're using it for. This will help coverage and save you time. It shouldn't be too precious as they tend to get trashed pretty quickly, and it has to be bone dry. Dab your brush in a little paint and start wiping the brush on a piece of kitchen paper or cloth. The idea is to get the paint off the brush and spread it through the bristles. This prevents streaks of paint from appearing and builds up a subtle colour. We're not really that worried about being subtle right now though, as we're building the khaki colour back up from the wash. We just want the brush dry enough that the paint won't get into the nice dark recesses. Quickly sweep your brush back and forth, trying to catch the raised edges. To add a bit of realism to the stone effect, we're going to sponge on some grey paint to give a bit of natural variation. I'm using Citadel's Mechanicus standard grey, but really you could use any grey, light or dark. Break off a bit of kitchen sponge and dab it into the paint. Now dab it on some kitchen paper or cloth again, just like the dry brush stage we just did. Now apply it randomly to the miniature surface. For extra variety, go a bit heavier on some models and lighter on others. Now we're going to apply a more sparing dry brush of a light creamy bone colour. I'm using Citadel's Ushabti bone, but most paint ranges have a dedicated bone colour that will work just fine. Slightly different from our first dry brush, try to remove a little more paint from the brush and focus your strokes more on the raised edges. Don't overdo it, as we still want to see a good amount of that nice khaki base coat underneath. Now we'll add one final layer of dry brushing. This is really just to give a subtle lift to the very tips and edges of the model. For this, I'm using Screaming Skull by Citadel. You can use any warm off-white you like, or create your own by mixing 2 parts of your bone with 1 part white. Again, we're going to remove as much paint as possible and be very sparing. You may want to use a smaller brush for this part, as it's important we don't overdo it. To complete our stone, I'm going to add a warmer shade randomly over the models using Citadel's Reikland Fleshshade. Most paint companies make their own flesh wash, and it'll do the same thing, just adding a little bit of a warmer edge to really complement the cold blue we'll be adding next. Now in this video I'm using the gloss version of Reikland Fleshshade, which you shouldn't really do as it'll add a gloss finish. I'll be adding a matte varnish to these models when they're completed, but if you have the non-gloss version, use that instead. And when that wash is dry, the stone is basically done. And now we can work on the blues. Choose what spots on your model you want to be glowing blue, and let's block them in. I'm using Vallejo's medium blue. Citadel's Crackle blue would be a fine substitute. Thin your paints on your palette using a tiny bit of water and get painting. You might want to use a finer brush for this to accurately get the blue right up to the edges of the stone, and don't worry too much if you paint a little bit of the stone, as we'll be creating a blue glow anyway, so it probably won't matter. If you really mess up, just wait for the blue to dry and fix it using your khaki colour. Now I'm going to create this blue glow using P3's Arcane Blue. It's a great turquoise paint that really looks awesome when used like this. There are 2 ways of making this glow effect. The first way, and the way I'm going to be showing you in this video, is by using the airbrush, and yes, I can hear you groaning from here. Make sure to subscribe, and in an upcoming video I'll show you how to achieve this effect using a paintbrush. It's still quite easy to do, it just takes more time than the airbrush. I'm going to skip over the details of how to prepare the paint for the airbrush, because if you own one you hopefully already know, and this isn't really what this video is about. A little puff over the centre of the deeper blue areas, and that's pretty much it. Although airbrushes take a lot of patience to learn how to use well and a lot of time to clean, they're really worth investing in if you're doing larger projects like this. My awesome girlfriend bought me an airbrush kit for my birthday, and it's actually a great set. It's the Rebel Starter Set, model 39199. At the moment I think you can get them for about £70, and they come with an airbrush, a hobby compressor, some paints, thinners, and all the little bits and pieces you need to get going, so it's well worth looking at if you're thinking about investing in an airbrush. I also found a great bargain nail art brush on eBay for about £10, which has a much more narrow spread, great for creating effects like this. To give the blue a bit more depth, we're going to go around the edges of the blue objects, the parts where the blue elements connect to the stone, and add a little blue wash. I'm using Drakenhof Nightshade, but any blue wash will do. Vallejo's Blue Shade wash is also great. Make sure your brush is a little damp, load up some wash, and carefully apply it to the edges. To finish off this glowing effect, we're going to add a much brighter turquoise, mixing white with our turquoise and a little bit of water to the centre of the glowing blue objects. For the mix I'm using Vallejo's white, but any pure or cool white will do, and using a fine brush just tease the central areas. And I'm gonna pause the video right here because I discovered that it's really difficult to paint fine details on miniatures with a camera right in front of your face, and I messed up. Oh god. Oh no. And the whole thing is ruined. I completed the rest of this stage off camera, so I apologise that you don't get to see the brushwork. If you want to learn how to improve your fine brushwork and edge highlighting, there are loads of videos out there made by people who are much better at it than me. Now to finish off the blue areas, I'm going to add a final glaze of Guilliman Blue by Citadel. This will enrich the blue and settle in the recesses, which will also hide some of my mistakes. Now the models are pretty much complete, let's paint the rims. I'm using Citadel's Mournfang Brown as it'll set off the rest of the model with a slightly warmer tone. Apply a little water to the paint and, holding the model carefully, apply the paint around the rim. You might want to add one or two more thin coats to this to keep the colour solid and prevent chipping in the future. And at this point we're basically done. If you want to add a protective varnish or lacquer to protect all that texture, let your models cure for a couple of days before adding your clear coat. Varnishing too quickly can sometimes make strange things happen to the finish and change the appearance of your paints. Once you're happy that your models are totally dry, apply a spray varnish just as we did when we were priming and base coating the models. You can also brush on varnishes, but be sure to follow the instructions on the label. For a nice little touch, I added some foliage to the models and bases. I used Javis Countryside Scenic's Autumn Brown Lichen. Just pinch off a few little bits, pop a bit of super glue or PVA on the base or model, and get the foliage in the right position. Using tweezers or a cocktail stick helps you not get super glue all over your fingers. And that's it! As you've seen, every stage was actually pretty easy, but the overall effect is really cool. I hope you've enjoyed this video. It's my first painting tutorial, so if you've got feedback, I'd love to hear it. Let me know in the comments what you'd like to see in the future, and I'll do my best. If you're looking for a list of paints and materials used in this video, you'll find it in the description. Please like and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time. Cheers!